Most people believe that emergency calls exist to protect the truth, that when someone dials 911, that recording becomes an anchor point, something fixed and undeniable, a moment that can't be rewritten, because voices don't lie easily, fear doesn't rehearse, and panic doesn't follow scripts. But this file shows how even the most direct piece of evidence can be quietly neutralized, without being erased. This call exists, it was recorded, it was logged, and yet, it was never played in court. When the call first comes in, it follows a familiar pattern. A voice on the other end, breathing that isn't steady, words that don't come out in the right order. Dispatchers are trained to listen for specific things, background sounds, timing, emotional cues. All of that is happening here. Nothing about the call feels unusual in isolation. In fact, it feels real to real. And that's exactly why what happens next matters. According to the official record, the call had no impact on the outcome of the case. It's mentioned briefly, then dismissed. The report suggests it didn't contain anything relevant. No actionable information, no contradictions, just noise. That explanation sounds reasonable. Until you realize something important. The call is referenced multiple times in internal notes, but never quoted. Not a single line of dialogue appears in the final report. Not a summary, not a transcript, just its existence, acknowledged and then pushed aside. Here's where most people assume there must be a good reason. Maybe the audio quality was poor. Maybe the caller was confused. Maybe it didn't line up with the timeline. But those reasons are never stated, and when something is excluded without explanation, that exclusion becomes part of the evidence. Because evidence doesn't have to prove something to matter, sometimes. It only has to raise a question. Inside the file, there's a timestamp showing exactly when the call was received. That timestamp overlaps with a critical window in the official timeline, a window that investigators later describe as clear and uninterrupted. But the call exists inside that same window, which means someone was reporting something. While the report later claims nothing significant was happening, that alone should have forced a closer look. It didn't. What makes emergency calls powerful isn't just what's said, it's when it's said. Timing can confirm or destroy a narrative. In this case, acknowledging the call fully would have required adjusting the timeline. And adjusting the timeline would have meant reopening assumptions already made. Instead, the call is treated like background noise, logged, archived, and effectively silenced. Imagine how the decision gets made, not in a dramatic meeting, not with malicious intent, but through small, quiet steps. One person decides it's not relevant enough, another assumes someone else already reviewed it. A third summarizes it in a sentence that removes its urgency. By the time the case reaches court, the call is no longer a voice. It's a footnote, and footnotes don't get played to juries. This is the moment where people often say, if it mattered, the defense would have used it, or the prosecution would have addressed it. But both sides rely on what's officially presented. If a piece of evidence never enters the spotlight, it effectively doesn't exist. The system doesn't require evidence to be false to ignore it. It only requires it to be inconvenient. There's another detail buried deeper in the file, a note indicating that the call was reviewed after the initial conclusion had already been formed. That order matters. Once a conclusion exists, new information is no longer neutral. It becomes something that either supports the conclusion or threatens it. And information that threatens conclusions has a habit of losing priority. Think about how different this feels compared to reading the summary. A summary tells you what to think. A recording forces you to listen. It forces you to confront uncertainty in real time. You hear hesitation, you hear fear. You hear things that don't fit neatly into reports. And that's exactly why recordings are powerful. They resist simplification. By the time the case moves forward, the call is never mentioned again. Not in opening statements, not in closing arguments, not in deliberations. It remains archived, untouched, technically preserved, but functionally erased. The system doesn't deny it exists. It just ensures it never has a voice. This file forces an uncomfortable realization. Truth isn't always suppressed by destroying evidence. Sometimes it's suppressed by burying it under procedure, by acknowledging it just enough to say it was considered, but never enough to let it speak for itself. When that happens, the absence becomes invisible, and invisible things don't raise alarms. Here's the part you should carry with you. Whenever you're told that a conclusion is solid, ask yourself what wasn't shown. Not what was emphasized, not what was summarized, but what existed and never made it into the room. Because the most dangerous gaps are the ones that are quietly accepted. This 911 call was never played in court, not because it was proven meaningless, but because playing it would have complicated the story. And complicated stories slow systems down. The case moved forward without it. The conclusion stood, and the recording stayed in the archive, unheard. This was File 003, and sometimes, what you don't hear matters more than what you're told.